What dangerous situation did authority figures ignore? My daughter Maya stopped sleeping in October. Not gradually. One day she was fine. The next, she was awake at 3 in the morning, pacing her room with dark circles under her eyes that looked like bruises. She was 12 years old and suddenly terrified to close her eyes in her own bedroom. When I asked what was wrong, she said the bus driver had been watching her. Not just looking, watching. Following her movements with his eyes in the rearview mirror in a way that made her skin crawl. She said he'd started asking her to stay behind after the other kids got off, claiming he needed to talk to her about something important. 3 times in 2 weeks he'd driven past her stop with her still on the bus, alone with him, before circling back and letting her off with an apology about being distracted. I called the school that morning, asked to speak with Principal Vernon about a safety concern regarding the bus driver. His secretary transferred me, and Vernon picked up sounding annoyed before I'd even explained the situation. I told him everything Maya had said. The staring, the requests to stay behind, the deliberate missing of her stop. Vernon sighed heavily into the phone like I'd just wasted his valuable time. He said driver Calloway had been with the district for 18 years without a single complaint, that Maya was probably misinterpreting friendly adult concern as something inappropriate, that preteen girls often dramatized situations for attention. I felt my jaw clench hearing him dismiss my daughter's fear so casually. I pushed back, said Maya wasn't dramatic, wasn't attention-seeking. She was genuinely frightened, and that deserved investigation regardless of Calloway's tenure. Vernon's tone shifted from annoyed to condescending. He explained that driver Calloway was a respected member of the community, volunteered at church, coached youth sports, had grandchildren of his own. The implication was clear. A man like that couldn't possibly be a threat. Vernon said he'd have a word with Calloway about being more aware of how his actions might be perceived, but that was the extent of action he was willing to take. No formal investigation, no change in Maya's bus assignment, just a conversation that would likely alert Calloway that someone was watching him. I hung up feeling sick. That evening I drove Maya to school myself. She was relieved but also ashamed, like she'd caused trouble over nothing. I assured her she'd done exactly right by telling me, that her instincts mattered, that adults who made children uncomfortable needed to be questioned, not blindly trusted, but I could see she didn't fully believe me. Vernon's dismissal had already planted seeds of self-doubt. Over the next week, 3 other parents contacted me. Word had spread through the parent network about my call to Vernon. Each parent had a daughter on Calloway's route. Each daughter had similar stories, uncomfortable staring, requests to stay behind, comments about how they were growing up so fast. One girl said Calloway had touched her shoulder and let his hand linger too long. Another said he'd asked about her boyfriend in a way that felt invasive and wrong. We organized a meeting at my house. 6 mothers sitting around my dining table comparing notes while our daughters played in the basement, grateful to finally have someone believe them. The pattern was unmistakable. Calloway targeted girls between 11 and 13, always when other students weren't around to witness, always with plausible deniability built into his actions, a concerned adult asking questions, a friendly touch that could be explained away, missing a stop by accident. Nothing overtly criminal, but everything designed to test boundaries and groom victims. We decided to go to the school board meeting, present our concerns formally, force them to take action. The meeting was the following Thursday. We arrived with 6 families, 12 parents total, and 5 girls brave enough to speak publicly. The board sat behind a long table looking bored and impatient as parents droned through complaints about parking lot traffic and cafeteria food quality. When it was our turn, I approached the microphone with my notes and my rage. I explained that we were there about driver Calloway, that multiple students had reported inappropriate behavior, that we'd already reported to Principal Vernon with no action taken, that our children's safety was being ignored. Board President Richard Strauss barely looked up from his papers. He said they'd received Vernon's report, that Vernon had investigated thoroughly and found no evidence of misconduct, that Calloway had been spoken to and the matter was resolved. Case closed. One of the other mothers stood up. Angela Torres. Her daughter Lucia was one of the girls Calloway had targeted. Angela's voice shook with controlled fury as she described Lucia's experiences. The staring, the touching, the deliberate isolation. She demanded to know what investigation Vernon had actually conducted beyond taking Calloway's word that nothing inappropriate had occurred. Strauss's expression hardened. He said the district had policies and procedures, that those had been followed, that they couldn't remove a valued employee based on vague feelings and unsubstantiated accusations from children who might be confused or mistaken. He suggested we were overreacting, that in his experience, parents often jumped to worst-case scenarios instead of considering innocent explanations. The dismissal was absolute. We weren't being heard. We were being managed and condescended to like hysterical women who didn't understand how the real world worked. The meeting moved on to the next agenda item while we sat there stunned and furious. After the meeting, several board members approached us in the parking lot, not to apologize or reconsider, to warn us. Board member Janet Holbrook told us quietly that making waves could backfire, that Calloway had friends in the community, that continuing to pursue this could affect our children's experience at school. Teachers might be less accommodating. Recommendations for programs might not materialize. Our kids could be labeled troublemakers. The threat was clear even if the words stayed technically polite. We were being told to shut up and accept that nothing would change. That night, I couldn't sleep. Kept thinking about those girls. About Maya terrified in her own bedroom. About a system designed to protect children that instead protected the adults who threatened them. I decided to document everything. Started a spreadsheet with dates, times, specific incidents, witnesses. Taught Maya and the other girls to write down every interaction with Calloway in detail immediately after it happened. If the authorities wouldn't investigate properly, I'd build an airtight case they couldn't ignore. The documentation revealed patterns even more disturbing than I'd realized. Calloway consistently altered his route to drive past certain girls' houses multiple times. He'd claimed road construction or traffic required detours, but parents checking confirmed no such obstacles existed. He'd started showing up at public places where the girls spent time. The library, the park, the mall, always with an excuse about running errands, but the frequency was impossible to dismiss as coincidence. One girl reported he'd driven slowly past her house at night when she was visible through her bedroom window. He'd waved. She'd closed the curtains and hidden in her closet until her parents came home. I brought the expanded documentation to the superintendent's office. Dr. Patricia Lawrence had been superintendent for 6 years. I'd voted for the board that hired her. I thought she'd be different from Vernon, more willing to prioritize student safety over protecting institutional reputation. I was wrong. Lawrence listened to my presentation with a neutral expression that gave away nothing. I showed her the spreadsheet, the detailed incident reports, the pattern of behavior that clearly indicated predatory grooming. I explained that 6 families had come forward and suspected others were too scared to speak up, that this was serious and getting worse. Lawrence thanked me for my concern and said she'd look into it. Her tone suggested I'd just reported a malfunctioning water fountain, not a potential predator with daily access to vulnerable children. 2 weeks passed with no word from her office. I called repeatedly, left messages, was told she was in meetings or unavailable. Finally, her secretary admitted that Lawrence had concluded her investigation. Calloway would be required to attend a professional development workshop on appropriate boundaries with students. That was the entirety of the consequence. I felt something break inside me when I heard that. A workshop. For a man exhibiting clear predatory behavior toward children. The system wasn't just failing to protect our daughters. It was actively enabling their abuse by refusing to acknowledge reality. I contacted a lawyer. Meredith King specialized in education law and had a reputation for not backing down from districts that prioritized image over safety. She reviewed all my documentation, and her expression grew grimmer with each page. She said I had enough for a formal complaint and possibly a lawsuit, but warned me the process would be brutal. The district would fight. They'd paint us as paranoid parents trying to destroy an innocent man's reputation. They'd drag our families through investigations. Our children would be questioned repeatedly about traumatic experiences. And even if we won, Calloway might just be quietly transferred to another school where he'd have access to new victims. But doing nothing meant Maya and the other girls remained at risk, meant future victims were inevitable. I told Meredith to file the complaint. We filed with the state education department, detailed every incident, every failed response from school authorities, every example of the district prioritizing Calloway's reputation over student safety. The state investigator assigned to our case was a woman named Rebecca Walsh. Wait, that name's forbidden. The investigator was named Rebecca Sullivan. She seemed competent and genuinely concerned during our initial interview. She interviewed all 6 girls, their parents, several teachers who'd witnessed concerning behavior but hadn't reported it, and reviewed district records of the complaints we'd filed. Her preliminary findings supported our concerns. Calloway's behavior fit established patterns of grooming. The district's response had been inadequate to the point of negligence. Then something changed. Sullivan's tone shifted in subsequent communications. She became evasive about timeline, started mentioning complications with the investigation. When her final report came out, it was a whitewash. She'd concluded that while some of Calloway's actions showed poor judgment, there was insufficient evidence of predatory intent. She recommended additional training for all district staff on appropriate student interactions, but no disciplinary action for Calloway. The report praised Vernon and Lawrence for their handling of the situation. Reading it felt like being gaslight. Everything we'd documented, every specific incident, every pattern of escalating behavior, had been reframed as misunderstanding and overreaction. Sullivan had been gotten to. I didn't know how or by whom, but someone had convinced her to bury the truth. Meredith wasn't surprised. She said this happened constantly in education cases. Districts had connections, resources, motivation to protect themselves from liability. Complainants were almost always outgunned, but she wasn't giving up. She filed a federal civil rights complaint, argued that the district's inaction created a hostile environment for female students, that the pattern of dismissing girls' concerns about male authority figures constituted sex-based discrimination. The complaint named the district, Vernon, Lawrence, Sullivan, for her compromised investigation, and Calloway personally. The lawsuit demanded Calloway's termination, mandatory reporter training for all district staff, policy changes to protect students who report concerns, and monetary damages for the families. The district's response was to go nuclear. They hired a prestigious law firm and filed counterclaims accusing us of defamation. They demanded we pay their legal fees for defending against our frivolous accusations. They leaked information to local media painting us as troubled families with unstable children looking for someone to blame for normal parenting challenges. The media coverage was devastating. Local newspaper ran an op-ed by someone claiming to be a friend of Calloway's family. It portrayed him as a dedicated public servant being destroyed by hysteria and false accusations, mentioned his decades of service, his volunteer work, his grandchildren, made him sound like a saint being crucified by angry mothers who couldn't accept that their daughters were growing up and sometimes felt uncomfortable with adult attention. The piece never mentioned the specific documented incidents, the pattern, the multiple families. It was pure character assassination disguised as concerned community commentary. Our families were harassed. Someone spray-painted "liar" on Angela's garage door. Another family found their car tires slashed. My email was hacked, and private messages discussing the case were leaked selectively to make us look conspiratorial and vindictive. Maya was bullied at school by kids whose parents had been told we were troublemakers trying to destroy a good man's reputation. The social pressure to drop the case was immense. 2 families withdrew from the lawsuit, said they couldn't handle the stress and harassment. I didn't blame them. This had become all-consuming and brutal. But 4 families remained committed. We'd come too far and seen too much of the system's corruption to walk away now. The deposition phase was worse than anything I'd experienced. Calloway's lawyers questioned me for 7 hours, asked invasive questions about my marriage, my mental health history, my relationship with Maya, suggested I was projecting my own issues onto innocent interactions, implied I was coaching Maya to lie, portrayed me as an unhinged parent, unable to accept normal adult-child dynamics. They did the same to the other parents, to the girls themselves, though those depositions were mercifully shorter and less aggressive due to their ages. Through all this, Calloway remained on his bus route, driving children daily. The district claimed they couldn't remove him without proof of wrongdoing, and since their investigation had cleared him, he remained in position. The girls refused to ride his bus anymore, which meant parents had to arrange alternative transportation. Maya's fear of him had evolved into something deeper. She'd developed anxiety about going to school at all, started having panic attacks. Her grades dropped. She stopped hanging out with friends. The trauma wasn't just from Calloway's initial behavior. It was from every authority figure who'd dismissed her, every adult who'd chosen protecting institutions over protecting her, every system that had failed when she'd asked for help. I took her to a therapist who specialized in childhood trauma. Dr. Ramos was excellent, gentle but clear about validating Maya's experiences. She explained that Maya's distress was a normal response to both the predatory behavior and the institutional betrayal that followed, that the adults who should have protected her had instead made her doubt her own perceptions and experiences, that secondary trauma from being disbelieved often caused more lasting damage than the initial incident. Dr. Ramos agreed to testify in our case about the psychological impact of the district's inaction. Her professional opinion was that the district's response had been not just inadequate, but actively harmful to the student victims. The depositions uncovered something crucial, an email from 3 years earlier. A parent had complained about Calloway then, different girl, similar behavior. The complaint had been filed with Vernon, who'd forwarded it to Lawrence with a note saying they should document but not pursue because the family had a history of causing trouble. No investigation was conducted. The complaint was buried. Calloway had faced no consequences, and the pattern continued. Meredith was elated when we found this. It proved the district knew about problematic behavior and deliberately chose not to act, established a pattern of institutional failure to protect students, showed that our complaints weren't isolated incidents but part of a larger problem the district was actively covering up. The district tried to have the email excluded as evidence, claimed attorney-client privilege, claimed it was taken out of context. The judge reviewed it in camera and ruled it admissible. That email became the cornerstone of our case. Discovery revealed more. 2 other complaints about Calloway over his 18-year tenure, both dismissed without investigation. Both families quietly told their concerns would be noted, but no action taken. One family had been threatened with defamation suits if they pursued the matter publicly. Calloway wasn't just a predator. He was a predator the district had knowingly protected for years, prioritizing their liability concerns and his reputation over student safety. The district realized they were in serious trouble, offered a settlement, substantial monetary damages for the families, Calloway's immediate retirement with full pension, policy changes including mandatory reporting and independent investigations of student complaints, but no admission of wrongdoing, no public acknowledgement that they'd failed. The settlement would be confidential. We'd sign NDAs preventing us from discussing the case publicly. Meredith advised accepting, said trials were unpredictable and the settlement guaranteed significant changes plus compensation. The other families wanted to accept. They were exhausted, financially strained, ready for this to end. I was torn. The money and policy changes were real victories, but letting Calloway retire with his reputation intact, letting the district hide their failure, felt like betrayal of future victims. We took a vote. 3 families wanted to settle. Mine was the only holdout. I was outvoted. We accepted the settlement. Calloway retired 2 weeks later. The district released a statement thanking him for his years of service and wishing him well in retirement. Made no mention of why he was leaving suddenly. To the community, he was a dedicated public servant retiring early for personal reasons. A good man rewarded for his contributions. The settlement money helped, paid for Maya's ongoing therapy, let us move to a different school district where she could have a fresh start. The policy changes were implemented, independent investigator for complaints about staff, mandatory reporting training, clear procedures for parents to escalate concerns. These were real improvements that would protect future students. But the confidentiality agreement meant we couldn't tell anyone what we'd learned. Couldn't warn other communities where Callaway might volunteer or work with children. Couldn't publicly call out Vernon and Lawrence for their role in enabling abuse. Couldn't share our story to help other families facing similar dismissals from authorities. The truth was buried again, just by settlement agreement, instead of institutional cover-up. Maya struggled for 2 years. The anxiety and panic attacks persisted. She needed medication and intensive therapy, developed trust issues with male authority figures that affected her ability to function in school. Her childhood had been stolen not just by Callaway but by every adult who'd failed to believe and protect her when she'd asked for help. Watching my daughter suffer while knowing the system had enabled her abuser was torture, but slowly, painfully, she began to heal. Found a new therapist who specialized in institutional betrayal trauma. Joined a support group for young women who'd been failed by systems meant to protect them. Started speaking privately to other teens about trusting their instincts and fighting back when adults dismissed their concerns. She turned her trauma into advocacy in small, careful ways that didn't violate our settlement agreement. I became obsessed with understanding how this happened, how so many people had seen warning signs and actively chose to ignore them. I researched institutional betrayal, found it was epidemic in schools, churches, sports organizations, anywhere adults had power over children and institutions. Prioritized reputation over safety. The pattern was always the same. Initial complaint dismissed as overreaction. Accused of misunderstanding. Credibility of victims questioned. Reputation and tenure of accused prioritized. Investigations that were perfunctory or non-existent. When evidence mounted, moved to protect the institution from liability rather than protect the children. Bury the truth through settlements and NDAs. Allow predators to move on to new victims. I started volunteering with an organization that advocated for better protections for children in institutional settings. Couldn't tell them my specific story because of the NDA, but could use my experience to push for policy changes. Lobbied for state legislation requiring independent investigations of abuse complaints in schools. For ending settlement NDAs in cases involving minors. For criminal penalties for administrators who deliberately failed to report or investigate child safety concerns. The work was frustrating and slow. Institutions fought these changes. Claimed they'd open schools to frivolous complaints, that they'd destroy careers over misunderstandings, that parents and children couldn't be trusted to report accurately without exaggeration. The same dismissive arguments that had been used against us were now being deployed at the legislative level to prevent accountability. 3 years after our settlement, I got a call from Meredith. Callaway had been arrested. He'd been volunteering at a youth recreation center in a town 40 miles away. Had been grooming a 13-year-old girl there. This time, the girl's father was a police officer who recognized predatory behavior and immediately reported to law enforcement instead of organizational administrators. Police investigation revealed Callaway had been cultivating relationships with multiple young girls at the center, had thousands of photos on his computer, some from his time as a bus driver, girls in their seats captured through the rearview mirror, zoomed in on their faces, their bodies. None were explicit, but the volume and focus were damning evidence of his obsession. The arrest made news. His name was published. Reporters started digging into his background. Discovered he'd retired suddenly from the school district after 18 years. Parents from his roots began coming forward with stories they'd never told before. Stories of their daughters feeling uncomfortable, of complaints dismissed, of being told they were overreacting. The pattern was even more extensive than we'd documented. At least 20 families over his tenure had raised concerns, all dismissed. All told Callaway was a good man they'd misunderstood. Maya saw the news coverage, came to me with her laptop showing Callaway's arrest, asked if she could speak to reporters. The NDA prevented me from discussing settlement details, but Maya hadn't signed anything. She was a minor at the time and not party to the agreement. Legally, she could tell her story. I called Meredith, who confirmed. Maya could speak freely. The NDA bound the parents, not the children who'd been victimized. Maya gave an interview to the local investigative journalism team, told them everything, how Callaway had targeted her, how she'd reported to school authorities, how they'd dismissed her concerns and threatened consequences for pushing back, how other families had come forward and been ignored, how the district had known about previous complaints and done nothing. The reporters investigated, obtained records through public information requests, found the buried complaints, the emails showing administrators knew and chose inaction, interviewed the previous families whose concerns had been dismissed, built a comprehensive story of systemic failure spanning nearly 2 decades. The exposé ran on the front page. School district protected predator. Despite repeated warnings, multiple families raised alarms about bus driver now facing child exploitation charges. The story named names: Vernon, Lawrence, board members who'd dismissed our concerns, documented specific instances where they'd chosen protecting reputation over protecting children. The community erupted. Parents were furious that they'd been kept in the dark about a known threat, that their children had been in Callaway's care while administrators ignored red flags, that the district had spent taxpayer money on legal fees to silence families trying to protect students. The superintendent and principal who'd replaced Lawrence and Vernon after their retirements issued statements claiming their predecessors' actions didn't reflect current district values. but the damage was done. Trust was shattered. Vernon and Lawrence were hauled before the school board to explain their actions. Both were retired and beyond the district's authority, but the board wanted public accountability. Vernon claimed he'd acted in good faith based on the information available at the time. That hindsight made everything look worse, but his decisions had been reasonable, that he couldn't be expected to remove an employee without concrete evidence. Lawrence said she'd relied on Vernon's investigation and Sullivan's state report, that she'd followed procedures, that it was unfair to judge her for not being omniscient. Neither showed remorse. Neither acknowledged they'd failed the children in their care. Both maintained they'd done their jobs properly within systemic constraints. The police investigation into Calloway revealed the full scope of his predation. He'd been targeting girls for his entire adult life, had brief employment at 3 different school districts over his career, leaving each after complaints surfaced. Each time, administrators had let him quietly move on, rather than report to law enforcement or flag him in employment systems. He'd always had glowing references, each district passing the problem to the next, rather than facing it directly. The district attorney charged Calloway with multiple counts of child exploitation, voyeurism, and tampering with evidence. His computer contained not just photos, but detailed journals documenting his fantasies and plans for escalating contact with victims. He'd been building toward physical assault, had specific girls targeted, had been conducting what he called research into their schedules and vulnerabilities. Maya's name was in those journals. So were the other girls who'd tried to report him. Reading the prosecutor's summary of evidence was sickening. This man had been obsessed with children, had spent decades perfecting his hunting techniques, had been in a position of daily access and authority while multiple systems failed to stop him. All because adults had valued institutional reputation and their own convenience over believing children. Calloway's trial was scheduled for 8 months later. He pleaded not guilty. His defense was that the photos were innocent, that the journals were fiction, that he was being persecuted for thought crimes and appropriate supervisory concern for students. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. Forensic psychologists testified that Calloway's journals and photo collection were classic evidence of paraphilic obsession. Parents testified about complaints and dismissals. Girls, now teenagers, testified about their experiences and trauma. Maya was one of them. She took the stand wearing her high school colors and told her story in a clear, strong voice, described how Calloway had targeted her, how authority figures had dismissed her, how the system had protected her abuser. She looked directly at Calloway as she testified, refusing to let him make her afraid anymore. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. Guilty on all counts. At sentencing, the judge was scathing. Called Calloway a predator who'd exploited his position to access victims. Noted the extensive evidence of planning and escalation. Acknowledged the institutional failures that had enabled his crimes. Sentenced him to 25 years in state prison with no possibility of parole for 15. The courtroom erupted in relief and tears. Parents hugged their daughters. Maya squeezed my hand so tight it hurt. This was justice finally, but it had taken so long and cost so much. Vernon and Lawrence faced no criminal charges. The district attorney said their actions, while morally reprehensible, didn't meet the legal standard for criminal neglect or endangering. They'd followed district procedures, even if those procedures were inadequate. Their failure was systemic and institutional rather than criminal. But there were civil consequences. Multiple families filed lawsuits against the district. These couldn't be settled quietly because Calloway's conviction was public record. Couldn't claim the families were overreacting when a jury had found their concerns justified. The district lost or settled every case, paid out millions in damages. The financial impact was so severe they had to cut programs and raise taxes. The political consequences were equally severe. Board members who'd dismissed our concerns lost re-election campaigns. Vernon and Lawrence's pensions were challenged in court, with families arguing they shouldn't profit from careers spent enabling abuse. Those cases dragged on, but the public pressure was intense. Sullivan, the state investigator who'd whitewashed her findings, was fired from the education department. An internal investigation found she'd had personal connections to board members that created conflicts of interest. Her compromised report had allowed Calloway to continue accessing victims for 3 additional years. She faced professional sanctions that ended her career. Maya graduated high school with honors. The anxiety and panic attacks had diminished with therapy, though she still struggled sometimes. She'd found strength in advocacy, speaking at schools about believing children when they report concerns about adults. Sharing her story had been traumatic, but also healing, turning her victimization into purpose. She was accepted to college with plans to study social work, wanted to help other families navigate systems designed to silence rather than protect them. The night before she left for college, we sat on the back porch watching the sunset. She thanked me for believing her, for fighting when everyone else had wanted us to accept comfortable lies. Said she knew how hard it had been, how much the battle had cost our family. I told her she'd been the brave one, that she'd trusted her instincts and spoken up when speaking up was terrifying, that every system had failed her but she'd survived anyway and turned that survival into strength. She asked if I thought it was worth it. All the pain and fighting and public exposure, whether things had really changed. I thought about that. Calloway was in prison. Policies had changed across the district, making it harder for future complaints to be dismissed. Other administrators had been put on notice that failing to protect students had real consequences. Families had been compensated, however inadequately, but Vernon and Lawrence still had their pensions. Sullivan faced no criminal charges. The systems that enabled Callaway still existed in countless other schools and institutions. It was worth it, I said finally. Not because we fixed everything or got perfect justice, but because you and those other girls will never wonder if you should have spoken up. You did everything right. The system failed you, but you didn't fail yourself. And maybe the next girl who sees something wrong will remember your story and fight back harder. That's worth something. Maya nodded, and we sat in silence, watching the sky turn dark, knowing the fight was never really over, but feeling okay with that. 5 years after Callaway's conviction, I received an invitation to speak at a state legislative hearing on mandatory reporting requirements for schools. They wanted testimony, from families affected by institutional failures to protect students. I flew to the Capitol and told our story to a committee of legislators, explained how many times we'd reported concerns, how administrators had dismissed and threatened us, how predators rely on institutional protection and victims' reluctance to cause trouble, how brave children need adults brave enough to believe them and act, even when it's uncomfortable or complicated. The bill passed, mandated independent investigations of child safety complaints, required referrals to law enforcement when patterns of concerning behavior emerged, created penalties for administrators who failed to report, ended confidential settlements involving minors, named it Maya's Law, after my daughter who'd survived institutional betrayal and turned her trauma into change. It wasn't perfect. It wouldn't prevent every failure, but it was something real and concrete born from our pain. Maya came to the signing ceremony, shook hands with legislators, smiled for photos, told reporters she hoped no other child would have to fight as hard as she did to be believed and protected. That night, watching my daughter advocate confidently for vulnerable kids she'd never meet, I felt something shift. The rage that had consumed me for years finally began to ease, not because justice was complete or systems were fixed, but because Maya had survived and was thriving despite everything, because predators like Callaway were in prison where they belonged, because authority figures knew they'd face consequences for ignoring dangers to children in their care. Sometimes survival and incremental progress are the only victories available. Sometimes you can't save everyone, but you fight anyway for the ones you can reach. Maya taught me that. She survived, spoke up, refused to be silenced, and changed a system that had tried to break her. That's not the justice story I wanted, but it's the one we got, and it turned out to be enough. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.